Watch your thoughts, they become words. Watch your words, they become actions. Watch your actions, they become habits. Watch your habits, they become character. Watch your character, for it becomes your destiny. Now, these words have occurred in many guises over the past several hundred years, but are often attributed to Frank Outlaw in 1997. Now, Frank was the founder and president of the Bilo stores, a chain of grocery stores in the Southwest. Now, regardless of their origin, and some references trace them back to England in the late 1600s, they are in sync with my personal philosophy and my leadership assessment and development processes. The heart of my work with executives over many years has been to drive the awareness for an individual of the substance, nature, and relationship that exists between that individual's thoughts, words, actions, and results. With that recognition, new thinking can occur, new words are spoken, and new actions can ultimately deliver new and more desirable results. My aggregate life experiences and learnings have contributed to the development of this personal philosophy and the different methodologies that I use in leadership assessment. But when I think about what more than anything else has contributed to shaping who I am today, it is without a doubt the experience and knowledge of my father, Eugene Selker. And fittingly, he just celebrated his 87th birthday, and also this past weekend was Father's Day. Now, my father's life and career contain several striking examples of Outlaw's words. In 1965, he was an active member of his local Kiwanis Club, and ultimately he became the chapter's president. One of the actions that he initiated and drove was to, on a regular basis, go to the VA hospital and assist recent returning vets who were ambulatory to really wheel them in their wheelchairs to attend Sunday religious services. The Kiwanis members would attend these services with the vets, strike up conversations, get to know them, and really bring, I can imagine, a much needed human connection to these vets who were traumatized from the recent experiences of the Vietnam War. Now, as an 8-year-old child, I accompanied my father on many of these visits and assisted him and his fellow Kiwanis members. Now, for a young child, this was a mixture of fun, excitement. It was also somewhat scary confrontation with the aftermath of war, as I was helping many of these vets who had recently lost their limbs in Vietnam. What I didn't know until many years later was that based on the numerous conversations my father had with these vets, he started doing research into Vietnam, its history, the history of our country's involvement. And driven by his desire initially, which was by these conversations, and we wanted to find out what had happened to these vets. Based on these conversations, he began to piece together his thoughts on the different political and social issues underlying the Vietnam War and on the war's history, and came to the conclusion and conviction that this was an unjust war that the U.S. had no business being in and fighting. He then did a fairly unthinkable thing for a local Kiwanis chapter president in 1965. He used the pulpit and bullhorn of his Kiwanis presidency to speak out against the escalation of our involvement in this war. Now, despite pressure from many Kiwanis members to cease and desist in doing this, he continued to beat the drum over the duration of his presidency around this message that we had no business being in Vietnam. Post-completion of his presidency, his involvement with Kiwanis diminished. I can imagine due to some of the pressure that he had felt. However, his actions impacted other local Kiwanis groups. A network of Kiwanis chapters was established when every Sunday went down to the VA hospital and assisted vets in a similar fashion. He also raised the consciousness of many Kiwanis members about the Vietnam War and the social issues threatening our country. Many of these vets then sought him out after he had ceased being involved in Kiwanis and thanked him for speaking up and for helping to change their minds and their thoughts on the war in Vietnam. Thoughts, words, actions, character. Now, several years later, my father became involved in the PATH Association. That stood for Plan of Action for Tomorrow's Housing. This was a nonprofit association that had formed in 1967 that had actually grown out of a commission that had been established by the Cleveland Associated Foundations, was the precursor to the Greater Cleveland Growth Association of today, to investigate housing problems and establish goals for making improvements. Now, that commission itself was a reaction to what became known as the Huff riots of 1966, which were riots that had occurred in the inner city in the Huff-Scoville neighborhood that had completely decimated multiple city blocks. And this 30-person committee was formed to investigate this and its causes and to issue a report with some potential solutions. And this report really outlined the thesis that the problems of housing and poverty in the city of Cleveland were intertwined and interrelated with endemic discrimination that was occurring in Cleveland suburbs, that was stopping the integration and the movement of lower income black families to the white suburbs of Cleveland. This group then forwarded proposals that cut across city governments and the private sector, the real estate and insurance sectors, to improve inner city housing, to spur the construction of new housing and the rehabilitation of neighborhoods that have been decimated, and to foster neighborhood integration. Now, by the time I was a teenager in the early 1970s, my father had been on PATH's Board of Trustees for several years and had become their board president. The first board president was a prominent attorney by the name of Jim Houston, who advocated for and spearheaded what was certainly an unprecedented and gutsy move of suing 5 Cleveland suburbs, all white suburban suburbs, for racial discrimination. My father, as a fellow attorney and board member, assisted in the formation of these lawsuits, and then when he became board president, really drove their prosecution. And ultimately, PATH was not successful in pressing these lawsuits, and actually by the end of 1974, the organization had lost its funding and had to close its doors. However, one of the stories my father told me years later was that as one of these lawsuits was winding its way through the court system, there was a zoning commission meeting in a city council in one of the well-known and fairly affluent Cleveland suburbs that, in fact, was one of the suburbs being sued. Now, my father had attended the zoning commission meeting not on behalf of PATH, but as an attorney in his private practice, representing a group of investors who wanted to take a new residential area within that suburb and develop it, but needed changes to occur in current zoning laws to allow that development to move forward. Now, this had nothing at all to do with PATH, my father's involvement in PATH, or the lawsuit charging racial discrimination that was, in fact, being tried within that city suburb at that time. But this lawsuit obviously had been getting much significant press, not just in that suburb, throughout the greater Cleveland area. So much to my father's surprise, post presenting the reasoning in this public meeting of why the changes they were advocating for in zoning laws would be good for the city, one of the zoning commission members said, "Mr. Selker, we know you here in our city. We know who you are and what you stand for. You are a friend of the niggers, and we don't want you or your development in our city." My father, in 1973, standing up for what is right and what he believes. One of the actions then taken by my father, I don't know whether it was 73 or 74, but certainly in that time frame, that he is still proud of, is the linking of his growing realizations about the societal impact of our involvement in the Vietnam War, his public stance taken with Kiwanis, and then his tenure as PATH's board president. Now, PATH was an organization that had really broad funding, both at the federal level and the state level and the city municipal level. There was also broad civic support extended across government to really the mainstay of the traditional and conservative business community of Greater Cleveland. In fact, their board was comprised of many of the movers and shakers in Cleveland's political and business establishment. Now, just reflect a minute on a few of the events that were occurring in the United States during PATH's formation in '67 to its demise in 1974. The growth of the civil rights movement, the increasing escalation of the Vietnam War, the multiple assassinations that occurred in society of Robert F. Kennedy, of Martin Luther King, and Malcolm X, the rioting and destruction of entire neighborhoods in LA and Chicago and Baltimore and Washington, D.C., and Detroit, Cleveland, and other cities, the Kent State shootings, the mass protests and marches across the country to stop the war in Vietnam on an increasing basis. Now, while PATH was pursuing its legal action to force the white suburbs of Cleveland to enact policies that would support integration, my father, along with PATH's executive director, a truly incredible man by the name of Charles Beard, convinced this ethnically and socially diverse board to adopt an astounding resolution. PATH publicly went on record stating that our continued involvement in the Vietnam War was ill-founded in its conception, that the war was being unjustly prosecuted based on the dissemination and perpetuation of misleading information, that this was resulting in the reinforcement of the conditions that were at the heart of a divided society, and ultimately that the reinforcement of those conditions was making it impossible to bring about the vision of integrated neighborhoods and the end of poverty that were central to PATH's mission. Thoughts, words, actions, behavior, and character. Ordinary actions being elevated to the extraordinary. A description of my father and my personal hero, Eugene Selker.